We often hear of the heroes of the Great War, the tanks, the trenches, the endless human suffering. But some stories were so terrifying, so bizarre, they were buried not by the earth, but by the state itself. In the isolated marshlands of Poland, a tiny Russian garrison faced a chemical attack that turned the world black. The soldiers who survived weren't men, they were walking corpses, and yet they won. This is a deep dive into the historical lie behind one of the most chilling events in military history, the attack of the dead men. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten corners of dark history and the secrets governments tried to bury, please take a second to hit that subscribe button now. It genuinely helps us continue these deep dives. To understand the horror of what happened in August 1915, we first have to understand the stage upon which this tragedy was set. This wasn't a battle fought in a glorious capital city with paved streets, nor was it a clash over a strategic industrial hub filled with factories. It was a war fought in a swamp. The Osowiec Fortress was a relic of a different era. Built in the late 19th century by the Russian Empire, it sat roughly 50 kilometers from the border of East Prussia. In modern military terms, by the time the Great War began, it was arguably obsolete. It was a sprawling complex of brick, earthworks, and concrete that was designed to stop 19th century cannonballs and infantry charges, not the high explosive fury of 20th century industrial warfare. But Osowiec possessed one specific attribute that made it invaluable, and ultimately a death trap for the men inside: its location. The fortress was built on the only solid strip of land in the middle of the massive, impassable Biberza marshes. These vast wetlands stretched for miles in every direction, a natural muddy moat that could swallow entire battalions of men, horses, and primitive tanks. To the north and south, the terrain was a nightmare of bog, water, and dense reeds, rendering any large-scale flanking maneuver by the German army impossible. The only solid dry corridor through this hydrological maze was the narrow tract of land upon which Osowiec sat. Running directly through this narrow corridor, protected by the fortress guns, was the Białystok-Grajewo railway line. This rail line was the jugular vein of the Russian army in the region. It was the primary route for moving troops and supplies from the Russian heartland to the front. If Germany wanted to invade Russia from this angle, they couldn't go around the marshes. They had to go through them, and to go through them, they had to break the lock. Osowiec was that lock. Manning this lock was the 226th Zemlyansky Infantry Regiment. These were not the elite guards of the Tsar, trained in the academies of St. Petersburg. These were regular men, mostly drawn from the Voronezh province. They were isolated, undersupplied, and largely forgotten by the high command. They were the sentinels at the gate, tasked with holding a brick wall against a tidal wave of steel. They lived in damp subterranean barracks, watching the fog roll off the marshes, knowing that eventually the Germans would come. By early 1915, the German offensive was in full swing. The German 8th and 10th armies were pushing hard, desperate to secure the railway line and break the stalemate. They had tried to take Osowiec in September of 1914 with a frontal assault, and it had been a tactical disaster. The marshes had done their job perfectly. The German heavy equipment sank into the bogs, and the Russian artillery, dialed in perfectly on the few dry paths, decimated the attackers. German field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg was furious. The gateway to the east was slammed shut, and a regiment of peasant infantrymen were holding up the entire German advance. He realized that standard infantry tactics would not work here. The mud was too deep. The Russian resolve was too thick. He needed to erase the fortress from the map entirely. The German command decided that if they could not take the fortress by storm, they would crush it into the earth. In February 1915, the Germans brought up the monsters. They deployed their heavy siege artillery, specifically the 420mm Gamma Mörser howitzers, famously nicknamed Big Bertha. These were not normal field cannons. These were siege breakers, the most terrifying conventional weapons on Earth at the time. They fired shells that weighed nearly a ton, 800 to 900 kilograms of hardened steel and high explosives. To give a sense of scale, A standard field gun shell might create a crater the size of a bathtub. A Big Bertha shell created a crater the size of a 2-story house. They were designed to crack open the ultra-modern steel forts of Belgium and France like eggshells. Against the old brick and concrete of Osowiec, they should have been absolute overkill. The bombardment began in earnest on February 25th. For 6 days, the sky above Osowiec turned into a conveyor belt of iron. The Germans rained down tens of thousands of heavy shells, along with hundreds of thousands of light artillery rounds. The earth shook so violently that the tremors were felt in towns 30 kilometers away. The landscape was churned into a moonscape of craters and debris. Inside the fortress, the scene was apocalyptic. The barracks were pulverized. The hospital was reduced to dust. The thick brick walls, built to withstand the wars of the previous century, crumbled under the weight of the new age. The Russian High Command, listening to the reports over the telegraph miles away, assumed the garrison was dead. They actually sent a message to the fortress commander, authorizing him to blow up what remained and retreat. They explicitly stated that they did not believe it was possible to survive such a fire, but the 226th didn't leave. They did what Russian soldiers have historically done best. They dug in. They retreated into the deepest underground casemates, burying themselves beneath the rubble of their own fortress. They lived in darkness, breathing concrete dust, shaking with every impact, but they held the line. When the shelling paused and the German infantry probed forward, expecting to find only corpses, they were met with withering machine gun fire from the ruins. The Big Berthas had failed. The fortress was destroyed, but the defense remained. This failure of the heavy artillery led directly to a sinister shift in German strategy. By July 1915, the Germans were desperate. They had spent months and vast amounts of ammunition trying to break Osowiec, and they had failed. They needed a new way to kill the men hiding deep in the earth. They needed a weapon that could flow around corners, sink into trenches, and enter the deepest bunkers where high explosives couldn't reach. They decided to use poison gas. The preparation for this new form of warfare was meticulous and chilling. Unlike artillery, which is loud and chaotic, the preparation for a gas attack is quiet and industrial. German pioneer units spent weeks moving massive gas cylinders to the front lines. They installed 30 gas batteries, comprising thousands of cylinders filled with a mixture of chlorine and bromine. Chlorine gas is a terrifying weapon. It is a choking agent that attacks the respiratory system, turning the water in the lungs into hydrochloric acid. The victim essentially drowns on dry land, their lungs dissolving from the inside out. The addition of bromine made the mixture even more corrosive. The Germans weren't just trying to flush the Russians out, they were trying to exterminate them. The only thing stopping the attack was the wind. For gas to be effective, the wind must blow from the attacker toward the defender. If the wind shifts, the gas blows back on your own troops. So for days, the entire front line waited. The Russian defenders observed the German activity, the digging, the movement of heavy canisters, and they suspected something terrible was coming. But they had no gas masks. The Russian Empire had not equipped its soldiers for chemical warfare. The men of the 226th were issued makeshift protection, simple cotton gauze bandages. They were told to soak these rags in water, or if water wasn't available, their own urine, and tie them around their faces. It was a medieval defense against a modern chemical weapon. By the night of August 5th, the wind finally shifted. A cold, steady breeze began to blow from the west, directly toward the Russian lines. The waiting was over. The German commanders checked the weather vanes, looked at the dark sky, and gave the order. The artillery fell silent, not because the battle was over, but to make way for the silence of the gas. At 4 a.m. on August the 6th, 1915, the signal flares went up. Along a 6-kilometer front, thousands of valves were opened simultaneously. There was no bang, only a massive, sustained hissing sound, like 1,000 vipers striking at once. A dark, greenish-yellow wall of fog began to rise from the German trenches. It was immense, estimated to be nearly 40 feet high, and it began to roll slowly, inexorably, across the marshland toward the doomed fortress. The isolation of Osowiec was now complete. They were cut off from the world, buried in rubble, and about to be engulfed by a cloud of death that would kill not just the men, but the grass, the trees, and the birds in the sky. The siege of steel had ended. The siege of chemistry had begun. The silence that followed the opening of the valves was more terrifying than the roar of any artillery barrage. For months, the men of Osowiec had lived in a world defined by the thunder of Big Bertha, shells, and the rattle of machine gun fire. Now, the battlefield fell into a hush that felt unnatural, a stillness that signaled not peace, but extinction. The gas cloud that rolled toward the Russian lines was a towering wall of darkness, estimated to be up to 40 feet high and 6 kilometers wide. It did not move like smoke, drifting lazily on the breeze. It moved like a fluid, heavy and low, hugging the contours of the earth. It poured into craters, flowed down into the trenches, and seeped through the cracks of the concrete bunkers. It was a pervasive, inescapable tide. As the cloud made contact with the environment, the world began to die. The first casualties were not the soldiers, but the land itself. The lush, marshy vegetation of the Bibrazar wetlands turned black and yellow within minutes. The leaves curled and crumbled into dust. The grass withered as if scorched by an invisible fire. The copper components on the Russian artillery pieces turned green with verdigris instantly, corroding before the eyes of the gunners. Birds that had been nesting in the trees fell dead from the sky, their small lungs overwhelmed in seconds. It was a scene of total ecological sterilization. For the men of the 226th Zemlyansky Regiment, the horror began with the smell. Chlorine gas has a distinctive odor, a sharp, stinging scent reminiscent of bleach and pineapples, often described as sickeningly sweet. But by the time they smelled it, it was already too late. The Russian soldiers scrambled to apply their primitive defenses. They had no rubberized masks, no charcoal filters, no oxygen tanks. They had only rags. In the panic of the pre-dawn darkness, men tore strips from their undershirts or dipped bandages into buckets of water. Following the desperate orders of their officers, many urinated on the cloths, hoping the ammonia would neutralize the chlorine. They pressed these foul, wet rags to their faces, their eyes watering, their chests tightening. But against a saturation attack of this magnitude, these measures were tragically insufficient. The gas was composed of a mixture of chlorine and bromine. When chlorine gas is inhaled, it reacts with the water in the mucous membranes of the lungs and throat. This chemical reaction creates hydrochloric acid. The soldiers were not just suffocating, they were being burned from the inside out. Their lung tissue began to dissolve, filling their airways with fluid and blood. They were drowning on dry land. The scene in the trenches was a vision of hell. Men clawed at their throats, gasping for air that wasn't there. They fell to the muddy floor of the trenches, convulsing in agony. The heavy gas settled in the low points, meaning that those who fell or were too wounded to stand were submerged in the highest concentration of the poison. The skin of the victims began to change color, turning a dark, bruised violet, and in some cases, a sickly shade of green. The corrosive air attacked their eyes, blinding them, leaving them stumbling in the dark, coughing up pieces of their own lungs. 3 entire companies of the 226th Regiment were wiped out almost instantly. In the forward trenches, companies 9, 10, and 11 ceased to exist as fighting units. Of the roughly 900 men in that sector, only a handful survived the initial wave. The silence returned, broken only by the wet, rattling rasp of the dying. Deep inside the fortress, the situation was barely better. The gas, heavier than air, seeped down the ventilation shafts and through the firing slits of the bunkers. The fortress commander, Lieutenant General Brummer, and his staff were protected by slightly better ventilation systems in the central citadel, but the infantry in the forward positions were on their own. By 5 a.m., the sun began to rise over a graveyard. The gas cloud had largely dissipated, drifting past the fortress and into the rear lines, leaving behind a trail of devastation that stretched for nearly 12 miles. The German command, watching from their positions, saw no movement. The Russian guns were silent. The trenches appeared empty. To the German observers, the operation was a complete success. They believed they had achieved a total kill. Confident that the fortress was now a tomb, the German infantry began their advance. This was not a tentative probe. It was a march of conquest. Over 7,000 German soldiers, comprising 14 battalions of the Landwehr division, stepped out of their trenches. They moved in close formation, walking upright, expecting no resistance. Their task was simply to occupy the empty fortifications, bury the Russian dead, and secure the railway line to Białystok. They marched through the blackened grass, stepping over the corpses of birds and small animals. They reached the first line of Russian trenches and found exactly what they expected: piles of bodies, faces wrapped in bloody rags, skin discolored by the toxin. The Germans moved deeper into the Russian lines, toward the ruins of the main defensive works. They were relaxed, weapons slung over shoulders, the tension of the siege replaced by the grim satisfaction of a scientific victory. But as they approached the remains of the scorched earthworks, something impossible happened. From the haze of the chemical lingering in the air, figures began to rise. They did not look like soldiers. They looked like monsters rising from a grave. These were the survivors of the 13th Company, led by 2nd Lieutenant Vladimir Kotlinski. There were barely 60 of them left. They were wrapped in bloody chemical-stained rags. Their uniforms were tattered and burned. Their faces were horrific masks of chemical burns and blood. Every breath they took was a wheezing, bubbling agony. They were spitting up blood and mucus with every step. By all medical logic, these men should have been in shock, comatose, or dead. The pain of the acid in their lungs should have rendered them incapacitated, but instead of lying down to die, they stood up. They picked up their rifles. They fixed their bayonets. Lieutenant Kotlinski, himself severely poisoned and knowing he had only hours to live, did not order a retreat. He did not order a surrender. He drew his saber and ordered a charge. This was the moment the history books would remember. The 60 survivors, coughing blood, half-blind, and staggering with exhaustion, launched themselves at the 7,000 advancing Germans. They let out a sound that was not a battle cry, but a terrifying, gurgling roar, the sound of men who were already dead, but refused to stop fighting. The psychological impact on the German soldiers was immediate and devastating. They had expected silence. They had expected corpses. Instead, they were faced with a vision of their own nightmares. To the superstitious minds of the infantry, seeing these disfigured, blood-soaked figures charging through the lingering green mist was terrifying. It looked as though the dead were rising to exact revenge. Panic, primal and uncontrollable, swept through the German ranks. These were disciplined soldiers, veterans of the Eastern Front, but they broke. The sheer horror of the dead men charging at them caused the lead German units to falter. Someone screamed. Someone dropped their rifle. And then the rout began. The German infantry turned and ran. In their desperate haste to escape the zombies emerging from the gas, they trampled each other. They got tangled in their own barbed wire traps. The panic spread like a contagion, rolling back through the 14 battalions. The Russian artillerymen, those few who had survived in the sealed turrets of the rear forts, saw the German retreat. Despite the confusion, they manned their guns. Realizing that their infantry brothers were launching a suicidal counterattack, they opened fire. The surviving Russian cannons began to pound the retreating German mass, adding high explosives to the chaos. But the true weapon of the day was not the artillery. It was the sheer, terrifying presence of Kotlinski and his men. They chased a force 70 times their size away from the fortress, driven by a final, desperate burst of adrenaline and hatred. They fired their rifles with trembling hands. They stabbed with their bayonets. They fought with the ferocity of men who had nothing left to lose because they had already lost their lives. This was the attack of the dead men. It was a victory won not by tactics, not by superior firepower, but by the sheer terrifying refusal of the human spirit to be extinguished by chemistry. The Germans, terrified and disorganized, retreated all the way back to their starting lines, leaving the dead men in possession of the fortress once more. As the sun climbed higher, the adrenaline faded, and the biological reality set in. The charge ended. The dead men collapsed. Lieutenant Kotlinski, the hero of the counterattack, died that evening from the catastrophic damage to his lungs. The fortress was held, but the garrison was finished. They had repelled the enemy, but the gas had done its work. The survivors were not celebrating. They were dying. The silence returned to Osowiec, but this time it was the silence of a legend being born. The green haze of the chlorine and bromine had begun to thin, drifting lazily toward the Russian rear lines, but the atmosphere it left behind was one of utter dread. As the German forces, comprised of 7,000 men from 14 battalions, marched toward the Osowiec ruins, they moved not with the caution of an advancing army, but with the casual confidence of an occupying force. They expected only silence, scattered equipment, and the grim task of counting the dead. They had won the siege not with courage, but with chemistry. This arrogance was their ultimate undoing. The first indication that something was horribly wrong came not as a volley of rifle fire, but as a sound, a peculiar, sickening sound of struggle. It was a rhythmic, wet gurgling, punctuated by the hacking, painful coughs that rattled deep within the chests of the few survivors. Then they appeared, from the shattered concrete, from the smoke-stained holes in the earth, and from behind the pulverized breastworks emerged the figures. The sight was immediate and utterly shattering to the German psyche. These were not the broken, surrendering remnants of a defeated garrison. They were spectres, walking nightmares clad in the tattered remnants of uniforms. The chemical burns had ravaged their faces, leaving the skin either blistered white or tinged with a sickly, bruised green. Many were blind, holding their rifles out before them, led only by the sound of the enemy's boots. The most terrifying element was the blood. The chlorine had caused them to cough up pieces of their own lungs, and the bloody phlegm smeared their hands, their mouths, and the rags wrapped around their faces. They looked exactly as if they had climbed straight out of a grave. This tiny, horrific force, barely 60 men strong, was all that remained of the 13th Company. At the head of this spectral formation was Lieutenant Vladimir Kotlinski. Though he was dying, every shallow breath a corrosive agony, his command remained absolute. He raised his blood-slicked saber in a gesture of final, desperate defiance. There was no military calculation left, only the unyielding will to choose the manner of one's own death. He issued the final command, charge. The sound they emitted was not a cheer of defiance or courage. It was a terrifying, inhuman blend of gurgling lungs, wheezing desperation, and rage. It was the sound of the dead refusing to rest. They stumbled, they staggered, and they fell, but they did not stop advancing on the 7,000 men before them. The psychological impact on the German infantry was immediate and catastrophic. They were trained to fight men, not demons. They were disciplined, professional soldiers, but they were overwhelmed by a wave of primal biological terror. They saw a manifestation of the chemical horror they had just unleashed, walking, bleeding, and demanding revenge. The lead battalion of the German force did not stand their ground. They did not retreat in an orderly fashion. They broke. The panic began with a few dropped rifles, a few terrified screams of disbelief, and then it spread like a wildfire through the ranks. Soldiers who had bravely faced machine guns suddenly turned and fled in a wild, unreasoning stampede. They could handle steel, but they could not handle the grotesque sight of these chemically ruined figures charging out of the poisonous mist. The rout was total and absolute. The Germans, utterly convinced they were being attacked by the living dead, turned their backs and ran blindly. In their haste, they tripped over each other, creating bottlenecks of panicked men. They became hopelessly entangled in their own barbed wire, tearing themselves apart in their desperation to escape the 60 choking spectres. The surviving Russian artillerymen, who had watched the whole scene unfold from the rear forts, seized the moment. They trained their guns on the retreating German chaos and opened fire, transforming the disorganized panic into a complete slaughter. In the end, the attack of the dead men lasted only moments. Lieutenant Kotlinski and his spectral band chased a force more than 100 times their size away from the fortress. They had achieved an impossible victory fueled by sheer visceral terror and the refusal to submit to a chemical execution. The Germans retreated all the way back to their starting lines, leaving behind weapons, supplies, and their dead. They had been routed not by firepower, but by the sight of 60 dying men. The climax was over, but the men who had won it were spent. Lieutenant Kotlinski, standing in the ruins, collapsed shortly thereafter, dying that evening from the irreparable damage to his lungs. The fortress was held, but the sacrifice was complete. The great act of heroism was over, leaving behind only the dead, the dying, and a myth that the Soviet state would soon try to bury forever. The screaming of the retreating German infantry eventually faded, swallowed by the dense forests and the marshes to the west. The frantic scrambling noise of 7,000 men fleeing in terror was replaced by a silence that was far more unnerving than the roar of battle. It was the silence of a graveyard, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the sound that would define the rest of the day, the wet, rattling, rhythmic coughing of the victors. The adrenaline that had fueled the charge of the dead men was a finite resource. It had allowed dying men to sprint, to shout, and to fight with the ferocity of demons, masking the catastrophic biological failure occurring within their bodies. But as the threat of the enemy vanished, so did the adrenaline. The biological reality came crashing back, with agonizing force. The 60 or so men who had routed an army collapsed. They did not cheer, they did not embrace. They simply fell where they stood, some into the mud of the trenches, others onto the concrete steps of the ruined ramparts. The weapon they had defeated, the German infantry, was gone, but the weapon they could not defeat, the chlorine and bromine gas, was still at work inside them. The scene inside the fortress ruins in the hours following the charge was a vision of purgatory. The gas cloud had dissipated, carried away by the wind, but it had left behind a residue that coated everything. The moisture on the stones was acidic. The water in the puddles was poisoned. Even the metal buttons on the soldiers' uniforms had turned a dull, sickly green, corroded by the oxidation of the gas. Medical triage, in the traditional sense, was impossible. The regimental doctors and medics, those who had survived, moved among the men with a sense of utter helplessness. There was no antidote for what had happened. The chlorine gas had reacted with the water in the soldiers' mucous membranes to create hydrochloric acid. This acid had burned the lining of the bronchial tubes and the alveoli, causing them to dissolve. The body's natural reaction to this trauma was to flood the lungs with fluid in a desperate attempt to flush out the irritant. The result was a horrific paradox. The men were drowning, but they were drowning on dry land, their lungs filling with their own fluids. The suffering was intimate and slow. Men lay propped against the shattered walls, their chests heaving in spasmodic jerks as they fought for a sliver of oxygen. Their skin, already damaged by the chemical burns, took on a darkening, cyanotic hue, a deep blue-grey, indicating that their blood was starving for air. They were thirsty, consumed by a raging chemical thirst, but drinking water was agonizing, and in many cases, the water supplies themselves had been contaminated by the gas cloud. Among the fallen was the architect of the miracle, Second Lieutenant Vladimir Kotlinski. He had led the charge with a saber in one hand and a pistol in the other, a figure of terrifying defiance. Now, he was just a broken man, his body finally surrendering to the toxins he had ignored for the sake of duty. Witnesses later recalled that he remained lucid for a short time, asking about the status of the perimeter and ensuring that the Germans had truly been repelled. But as the evening approached, his condition deteriorated rapidly. The swelling in his respiratory tract closed off his airway. He died that evening, not from a bullet, but from the quiet, inevitable suffocation that claimed nearly all the participants of the charge. He was 21 years old. As the sun began to set on August 6th, the fortress of Osowiec was a landscape of the surreal. The dead men had held the ground, but the ground itself was dead. The grass was black and brittle, crumbling underfoot like ash. The leaves on the trees had withered and fallen in a single afternoon, creating a bizarre autumnal scene in the height of summer. The bodies of thousands of birds littered the courtyard, their small forms twisted by the poison. To the defenders, looking out over the parapets, it must have seemed as if they had defended the end of the world. However, the tragedy of Osowiec was about to transition from the physical to the strategic. While the 226th Zemlianski Regiment had been fighting their apocalyptic battle, the rest of the war had moved on without them. The Russian High Command, operating from safe headquarters hundreds of miles to the east, was in the midst of a massive, chaotic reorganization. The German offensive across the wider front, the Gorlich-Tarnów offensive, had been a devastating success. The Russian lines to the north and south of Osowiec had shattered weeks ago. The Great Retreat was underway. The Russian armies were pulling back hundreds of kilometers to avoid encirclement, abandoning Poland entirely to shorten their defensive lines. The railway line that Osowiec protected, the vital artery that ran from Białystok to Grajewo, was no longer a lifeline. It was a road to nowhere. The strategic logic that had dictated the defense of Osowiec, the logic that justified the death of thousands of men and the endurance of months of shelling, had evaporated. In the late hours of August 6th, or perhaps the early morning of August 7th, the telegraph lines that were still miraculously functioning delivered the final verdict. It was an order from the High Command. It did not contain congratulations. It did not promise reinforcements. It contained a single cold directive: evacuate the fortress, demolish all fortifications, retreat. The irony was crushing. The men of Osowiec had just performed one of the greatest defensive feats in military history. They had repelled a force nearly 100 times their size. They had survived a weapon of mass destruction, and now they were being told that their victory was meaningless. The ground they had died for was to be given to the Germans anyway, not taken by force, but abandoned by order. The survivors, now numbering fewer than 100 men capable of walking, were forced to summon their last reserves of strength for a task that was perhaps more painful than the fighting, the destruction of their home. They became the demolition crew of their own glory. For the next several days, the dead men limped through the ruins, carrying crates of dynamite and black powder. They moved with the slow, deliberate motions of the exhausted, planting explosives in the foundations of the forts they had bled to protect. They rigged the massive concrete casemates of Fort Isai, the central citadel where they had huddled during the Big Bertha bombardments. They wired the remaining artillery magazines, ensuring that the Germans would find no ammunition to turn against the retreating Russian army. They placed charges on the railway bridge, the very structure that gave the fortress its purpose. It was a grim, mechanical process. The air was still thick with the smell of decay, the rotting bodies of the German soldiers in the field, the Russian dead in the trenches, and the lingering sweet-sour scent of the chlorine. The men worked in a stupor, their coughing echoing through the empty tunnels. Every fuse they laid was an admission of defeat in the face of victory. Finally, on August 18th, nearly 2 weeks after the gas attack, though the evacuation began much earlier for the wounded, the work was done. The last of the garrison, a ghostly procession of bandaged, scarred, and coughing men, marched out of the fortress gates. They did not march in formation. They were a ragged line of survivors, supporting each other, moving slowly along the road toward Białystok. They walked away from the graves of their friends. They walked away from the body of Lieutenant Kotlinski. They walked away from the scene of their nightmare. Behind them, the engineers triggered the detonators. The explosion was cataclysmic. The stores of gunpowder and heavy shells that could not be carried away were detonated simultaneously. A massive pillar of smoke and dust rose into the summer sky, visible for miles. The deep earth-shaking roar signaled the end of Osowiec. The walls that had defied the 420mm siege mortars were torn apart from the inside. The concrete bunkers collapsed into the marshes. The railway bridge twisted and fell into the Bibrza River. When the German patrols finally returned to the site a few days later, advancing cautiously with respirators fixed to their faces, they found nothing. There were no dead men waiting to charge them. There was no garrison to surrender. There was only a smoking crater field, a landscape of pulverized brick and twisted metal. The fortress had not been conquered. It had committed suicide. The survivors of the 226th Regiment melted into the retreating masses of the Russian Imperial Army. They were absorbed into other units, their specific identity as the defenders of Osowiec diluted by the chaos of the collapsing Eastern Front. They carried with them the physical scars of the gas, the chronic bronchitis, the scarred corneas, the weakened hearts, but they also carried the heavy burden of a story that no one seemed to want to hear. In the eyes of the High Command, Osowiec was a failure because the position was lost. In the eyes of the incoming Bolshevik revolutionaries who would soon seize power, the heroism of a Tsarist officer like Kotlinski was inconvenient and counter-revolutionary. The story of the attack of the dead men began to fade before the smoke had even cleared from the demolition. The soldiers had won the battle against the Germans, but they were about to lose the battle against history. The silence that settled over the marshes was the beginning of a new kind of cover-up, not one of earth and gas, but of ink and ideology. The true death of the dead men was not in the gas attack, but in the decades of silence that followed. The physical destruction of the Osowiec Fortress was absolute. When the engineers detonated the magazines and crumbled the walls into the marsh, they ensured that no military force, German or Russian, could ever use that strategic gateway again. But while the brick and mortar were erased in 1915, the memory of what happened there was subjected to a much slower, more deliberate form of destruction. For decades, the attack of the dead men did not exist in the official history books. It was a ghost story, a rumor whispered by veterans in smoke-filled rooms, but it was absent from the school curriculums and the grand military encyclopedias of the 20th century. To understand why such a visceral, cinematic moment of human endurance was buried, we have to look not at the military strategy of World War I, but at the political upheaval that followed it. The primary executioner of the Osowiec legend was the Soviet Union. Less than 2 years after the gas attack, the Russian Empire collapsed. The Tsar was overthrown, and the Bolshevik Revolution swept across the country, replacing the imperial eagle with the hammer and sickle. The new Soviet government was engaged in a brutal civil war to consolidate power, and part of that consolidation involved a total rewriting of history. The Soviet narrative relied on a specific rigid worldview. The Tsarist era was a time of incompetence, weakness, and oppression. The imperial army was depicted as a backward, poorly led force where noble officers abused peasant soldiers, leading them to senseless slaughter. To the Bolshevik propagandists, the Great War was an imperialist war, a shameful conflict that served only the interests of kings and capitalists. In this new ideological reality, Lieutenant Vladimir Kotlinski was a problem. Kotlinski was a hero, but he was the wrong kind of hero. He was an officer of the imperial army. He was a symbol of the old regime's capacity for courage and leadership. To celebrate him, to build statues to him, or teach children about his desperate charge, would have been to admit that the Tsarist army was capable of greatness. It would have humanized the class of people the Soviets were actively trying to demonize and liquidate. Consequently, the Soviet censors went to work. The Battle of Osowiec was minimized. If it was mentioned at all in Soviet military histories, it was reduced to a footnote about the horrors of chemical warfare or a critique of the lack of gas masks provided by the Tsar's government. The heroism of the counterattack was stripped away. The image of the dead men charging the Germans was considered too individualistic, too romantic, and too tied to the old Russia. Instead, the Soviets built their own pantheon of heroes from the Civil War, and later, the Great Patriotic War, World War II. The 226th Zemlyansky Regiment was dissolved, its records scattered or locked away in the deepest vaults of the military archives. The survivors, those who had marched away from the ruins, learned quickly that it was dangerous to talk about the old days with too much pride. In the paranoia of the Stalinist era, being too closely associated with the glory of the Imperial Army, could be seen as counter-revolutionary behavior. So, the silence deepened. The attack of the dead men became a forbidden memory. It wasn't just the Soviets who had an interest in forgetting. The Germans too were complicit in the silence, though for different reasons. The German military pride was built on discipline, technology, and superiority. The official German reports of the battle were dry and clinical. They acknowledged that the gas attack had been less effective than anticipated, and that the fortress had been stubbornly defended. But they did not dwell on the panic. No German field marshal wanted to document the fact that 14 battalions of the Kaiser's best troops had been routed by 60 dying men. It was a humiliating blemish on the record of the German Pioneer Corps and the infantry. It was an embarrassment that didn't fit the narrative of Teutonic martial prowess. The story was squeezed between these two massive powers, one trying to erase the past to build a new future, and the other trying to hide a shameful defeat. For 70 years, the truth of Osowiec lay dormant. It survived only in the most fragile of vessels, personal diaries, letters sent home by soldiers before they died, and the oral histories passed down in the families of the survivors. It was a legend kept alive by the people, while the state tried to kill it. The resurrection of the dead men only began with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. As the iron grip of censorship loosened and the archives in Moscow were finally thrown open to independent researchers, historians began to piece together the fragments of the Eastern Front. They found the original combat reports from 1915. They found the frantic German communique describing madmen rising from the gas. They found the service record of Vladimir Kotlinski. In the last 2 decades, the story has exploded back into the public consciousness. It has inspired heavy metal songs, graphic novels, and short films. But this modern popularity carries its own irony. We look back at it now as a cool, zombie-like moment of badass history, often forgetting the sheer, tragic waste that it represents. The attack of the dead men was not a victory in the traditional sense. It didn't change the outcome of the war. It didn't save the Russian Empire. It was a moment of pure, distilled human spirit, a refusal to die quietly when science and steel said you should. The final horror of Osowiec is not the gas, or the blood, or the ruins. It is the fact that for most of the 20th century, the world was made to forget that these men ever existed. We are only now, a century later, giving them the memorial they earned in the span of a single, breathless charge. The fortress is gone. The marsh has reclaimed the stones. But the lie has finally been broken. To truly understand the miracle of Osowiec, we must stop looking at the Russian defenders for a moment and look instead at the invisible enemy they fought. The attack of the dead men is not just a story of human grit. It is a story of industrial chemistry. It is the collision of the 19th century human spirit with 20th century science. The horror that descended on the fortress on August 6, 1915, was not random. It was a carefully calculated, laboratory-brewed cocktail designed by one of the most brilliant minds in Europe. To understand the dead men, we must first understand the man who killed them, Fritz Haber. Fritz Haber was a German Jewish chemist, a patriot, and a genius. He is often called the father of chemical warfare. His philosophy was chillingly utilitarian. He believed that if science could create a weapon so terrible that it broke the stalemate of the trenches, it would ultimately save lives by ending the war sooner. He famously stated, "In peace, the scientist belongs to the world. In war, he belongs to his country." Haber knew that the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 strictly forbade the use of poison or poisoned weapons. However, the German High Command, guided by Haber's legalistic interpretation, found a loophole. The convention forbade the firing of projectiles filled with poison. It said nothing about releasing gas from static cylinders and letting the wind carry it. This bureaucratic technicality is what sealed the fate of the men at Osowiec. The weapon brought to the fortress was not simple chlorine gas, which had been used at Ypres earlier in the year. The German chemists had refined the formula. They created a mixture of chlorine and bromine. This distinction is critical. Chlorine is a choking agent. It attacks the respiratory system. Bromine, however, is a heavy, oily, corrosive irritant. It attacks the eyes and the skin. When this specific mixture was released into the humid, marshy air of the Biberza wetlands, a terrifying chemical reaction occurred. The chlorine atoms reacted with the moisture in the air and the moisture in the soldiers' throats to form two distinct acids, hydrochloric acid and hypochlorous acid. We must look at the physiological horror of this in detail to understand why the Russians looked like zombies. When a soldier of the 226th Regiment inhaled this mixture, the first sensation was not pain, but a taste. Survivors often described a metallic, acidic taste, sometimes likened to pepper and pineapple. Seconds later, the hydrochloric acid began to dissolve the mucous membranes of the throat and trachea. The body's immediate reflex is to cough, a violent spasmodic retching to expel the intruder. But in a gas cloud, coughing is a death sentence. It forces the victim to inhale more of the gas, drawing it deeper into the lungs, into the delicate bronchioles and alveoli. Once the acid reached the alveoli, the tiny sacs responsible for putting oxygen into the blood, it burned through them. The body, sensing catastrophic burn damage, rushed blood and plasma to the site to try and heal it. But in the confined space of the lungs, this fluid had nowhere to go. The lungs filled up. The soldiers were suffering from toxic pulmonary edema. They were, quite literally, drowning in their own body fluids while standing on dry land. But the bromine added the visual horror. It attacked the eyes, causing the capillaries to burst, turning the whites of the eyes a solid, bloody red. It attacked the skin, chemically burning the face and hands, turning the flesh a sickly, bruised, violet-green color. This is why the German soldiers were so terrified. They didn't see human beings. They saw men with red eyes, green skin, and blood pouring from their mouths, screaming without sound. Now, let us shift the camera to the other side of the battlefield. The German perspective is often left out of this story, but it is essential for a 2-hour deep dive. The German soldiers of the 11th Landwehr Division were not monsters. They were terrified men relying on a weapon they didn't fully understand. The German infantry had a deep superstitious fear of the gas pioneer, the special units tasked with handling the cylinders. They were seen as black magicians of the front. The infantry knew that if the wind shifted, they would be the ones dying. On the morning of August the 6th, the German soldiers were waiting in their trenches, wearing their own protective gear. Unlike the Russians with their rags, the Germans had the Gummimaske, rubber mask. These were primitive, heavy, rubberized canvas masks with a distinct snout filter. They were hot, claustrophobic, and smelled of treated rubber. Imagine the experience of the German soldier that morning. He watches the pioneer units open the valves. He hears the hissing sound, the song of the viper. He watches the green wall rise and roll away from him. He is told by his officers that the war is over in this sector. He is told that no human being can survive what has just been released. When the order came to advance, the German troops walked into a silent world. They walked through the tall marsh grass, which had turned black and brittle. They stepped over thousands of dead birds. They passed the forward Russian listening posts and saw the scouts dead in the mud, their faces twisted in agony. This walk through the dead zone did something to the German psyche. It created a sense of guilt and unease. It wasn't a battle, it was a cleanup operation. They relaxed, they slung their rifles, they let their guard down, believing that science had done the killing for them. This psychological state is crucial to explaining the rout. When the dead men of the 13th Company rose from the ruins, the Germans experienced a cognitive break. In psychology, there is a concept called the uncanny valley. It describes the revulsion humans feel when they see something that looks human, but wrong, like a corpse that is moving. When the Germans saw Kotlinski's men, they hit the uncanny valley hard. These figures were coughing up pieces of their own lungs. They were bleeding from the eyes. They were staggering. By all the laws of nature and medicine the Germans understood, these men should be dead. The fact that they were attacking triggered a primal biological panic that bypassed all military training. The German route wasn't just fear of being shot, it was a fear of the supernatural. German war diaries recovered years later speak of the confusion. Officers reported that their men screamed about ghosts and devils. They threw away their rifles, their only means of defense, to run faster. They became entangled in their own barbed wire, trampling each other in a desperate bid to escape the monsters emerging from the green fog. There is also a tactical irony to the chemical weapon that day. The gas was too effective. Because the mixture was heavy and the air was humid, the gas lingered in the craters and the ruins of the fortress. When the Germans advanced, they were walking into a contaminated zone. They had to keep their masks on. Fighting in a gas mask in 1915 was a nightmare. Your peripheral vision is gone. Your breathing is labored. You are sweating profusely. When the Russians charged, the Germans were sensory deprived, encased in rubber and panicked. The Russians, who had no masks, could see clearly and move freely, despite their dying bodies. In a strange twist of fate, the lack of equipment actually aided the ferocity of the Russian counterattack, while the superior German equipment isolated and confused the attackers. We must also consider the environmental legacy of Chapter 6. The amount of poison released that day was staggering. It didn't just kill the men, it killed the ecosystem. For years after 1915, the locals considered the marshes around Osowiec to be cursed. Cattle couldn't graze there. The water in the stagnant pools remained toxic. The copper and brass of the fortress fittings remained corroded and green for decades, a chemical fingerprint left by the crime. Modern archaeologists who visit the site today report a haunting atmosphere. The brickwork in the old fort still bears the scars of the chemical corrosion. The mass graves found in the area show skeletons with no bullet wounds, victims of the silent killer. Fritz Haber, the architect of this horror, would go on to have a tragic life. His wife, Clara Immerwahr, who was also a chemist, was so horrified by his work on chlorine gas that she committed suicide using his service pistol shortly after the first gas attack at Ypres. In a way, she was the first victim of the moral weight of what happened at places like Osowiec. The alchemy of death at Osowiec proved that you could destroy the human body with science. You could liquefy the lungs and burn the eyes, but it also proved the one variable that Haber and the German High Command forgot to put in their equation, the human spirit. They calculated the lethal dose, they calculated the wind speed, they calculated the dispersion rate, but they did not calculate that a man like Vladimir Kotlinski could be biologically dead, his body failing, his blood turning to acid, and yet still have the will to stand up, draw a saber, and charge. We have spent a great deal of time analyzing the mechanics of the massacre. We have looked at the strategic maps, the chemical formulas of Fritz Haber, and the psychological collapse of the German infantry. But there is a danger in this kind of deep dive. When we focus too heavily on the how, the tactics, the gas, the explosions, we risk losing sight of the who. The attack of the dead men was not carried out by faceless mythological creatures. It was not carried out by the Russians as a monolithic concept. It was carried out by specific men with names, families, and histories who woke up on that Tuesday morning in August not knowing they were about to become legends. To fully understand the weight of this event, we must perform a forensic resurrection of the 13th Company. We must walk among the ghosts. The unit at the center of the storm was the 226th Zemlyansky Infantry Regiment. In the hierarchy of the Imperial Russian Army, this was not a glamorous unit. They were not the Pavlovsky Guards with their polished boots and high society connections in St. Petersburg. They were a line infantry regiment formed primarily from reservists. The name Zemlyansky tells us exactly who they were. They hailed from the Zemlyansk Uyezd, a district in the Voronezh Governorate of southern Russia. These were men of the Black Earth. Before the war, they were not soldiers. They were farmers, laborers, and peasants. They were men accustomed to hard labor, harsh winters, and the quiet rhythms of rural life. They were drafted into the chaos of the Great War, transported hundreds of miles from the rolling plains of Voronezh to the wet, suffocating marshes of Poland. There is a profound tragedy in this demographic reality. The men who were subjected to the most modern, industrial, scientific weapon of the 20th century were men whose lives were defined by the agrarian traditions of the 19th century. They were men of the soil fighting a war of chemistry. At the head of this spectral formation was a man whose name has become synonymous with the battle, yet about whom we know frustratingly little: Sub-Lieutenant Vladimir Karpovich Kotlinski. In most retellings of the story, Kotlinski is portrayed as a bearded, stoic veteran. The reality is far more poignant. Vladimir Kotlinski was a boy. He was born in roughly 1894, making him just 21 years old on the day of the charge. He was not a career soldier with decades of experience. He was a junior officer, a podporuchik, placed in command of the 13th Company essentially by attrition. By August 1915, the senior leadership of the fortress defense had been decimated. The constant shelling and the initial gas wave had killed or incapacitated many of the captains and majors. The burden of command fell to Kotlinski, not because he was the chosen one, but because he was the one still standing. We can only imagine the psychological state of this young man on the morning of August the 6th. He had watched his company dissolve. He had watched his friends die in agony, coughing up their lungs. He himself had inhaled the gas. He was suffering from acute chemical poisoning, his vision blurring, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, his own blood poisoning him from the inside. And yet, in that moment of total biological collapse, Kotlinski made a decision that defies medical explanation. A standard military reaction would have been to seek aid, to curl up, to surrender to the inevitable darkness. Instead, Kotlinski found a reservoir of will that transcended his physical age and condition. He didn't just participate in the charge, he orchestrated it. Survivors' accounts, though fragmentary, describe him moving along the trench line, rallying the men who were huddled in the dirt. He wasn't barking orders like a drill sergeant. He was pleading with them, urging them to die with their rifles in their hands rather than choking in the mud. He understood that if they stayed in the trenches, the gas would settle and kill them all. Their only chance of survival, or at least of a dignified death, was to run forward, out of the low-lying gas, and into the fresh air, and into the German guns. Kotlinski led the charge from the front. He was the first dead man the Germans saw. He survived the charge itself, witnessing the German rout, but the damage to his body was absolute. He collapsed shortly after the position was retaken. He didn't die instantly. He lingered until the evening, suffocating slowly as his lungs filled with fluid. In a final tragic act of bureaucracy, he was posthumously awarded the Order of St. George, 4th class, for outstanding courage. The medal was sent to a mother in Voronezh, who would never see her son again. But Kotlinski was not the only notable figure in the mist. There is another name associated with Osowiec, one that leads us down a fascinating deep dive, rabbit hole into the world of art. Serving in the fortress engineers at Osowiec was a young officer named Władysław Strzemiński. Strzemiński would survive the war, but he would not emerge unscathed. In 1916, shortly after the events at Osowiec, he was horribly mutilated by a grenade explosion, losing an arm, a leg, and the sight in one eye. But Strzemiński did not fade into obscurity. He went on to become one of the most important avant-garde artists of the 20th century. He was a pioneer of constructivism and the creator of the art movement known as Unism. Art historians have long speculated on the connection between his radical, fragmented art style and his experiences in the trenches of Osowiec. His work often focuses on the after image, the image that remains on the retina after you look away. It is a haunting thought. Did the visual horror of Osowiec, the green fog, the melting landscapes, the fragmented bodies of the dead men, shape the vision of one of Europe's greatest modernists? Strzemiński's art is defined by a lack of center, a sense of disintegration. It is not a stretch to say that the attack of the dead men birthed not just a military legend, but a new way of seeing the world, a world broken by technology. And then there are the men whose names we do not know. The 13th Company started the day with roughly 226 men. By the time of the charge, barely 60 were mobile. By the end of the day, almost all were dead or dying. These nameless soldiers represent the true horror of the event. They were not officers. They did not leave behind diaries. They were the Ivan Ivanovs of the Imperial Army. They were the ones who had to wrap the urine-soaked rags around their faces. They were the ones who had to fix bayonets with hands that were chemically burned. We have to consider the intense physical intimacy of their suffering. In a modern war, you might die from a drone strike or a missile, a death from a distance. At Osowiec, the death was inside you. It was a betrayal of your own body. These men spent their final moments listening to their friends drown in dry air. They saw the people they grew up with in the villages of Voronezh turn into monsters before their eyes. There is a specific account from a survivor that speaks to the surreal nature of the camaraderie in those final moments. He recalled that during the charge, the men were not shouting battle cries. They couldn't. Their throats were burned away. They were making a low, guttural noise, a collective moan of agony that rose in volume as they ran. It was this sound of the dead, that broke the German morale. The Germans were prepared for shouting. They were prepared for silence. They were not prepared for the sound of 60 men gurgling their own death throes while sprinting toward them. We must also acknowledge the leadership of the fortress commander, Major General Nikolai Brummer. While Kotlinski led the charge on the ground, Brummer held the fortress together from the center. He is often criticized for his initial order to abandon the dead, but in reality, Brummer was a pragmatist facing an impossible situation. Brummer was the one who kept the telegraph lines open. He was the one who coordinated the artillery fire from the rear forts that turned the German retreat into a massacre. He was a man of the old school, watching the rules of warfare crumble around him. He represents the command structure that failed to provide gas masks, yet succeeded in instilling the discipline that allowed the men to stand and fight without them. Finally, we must look at the dead men as a mirror to the enemy. The German soldiers who faced them were also men. They were the Landwehr, older reservists, family men, not the fanatical stormtroopers of the later war. They had been told by their superiors that the gas would make the capture of the fortress a walk in the park. They were promised an easy victory. When they saw the Russians charge, the betrayal they felt was absolute. Their own science had failed them. This easy victory was a lie. In that moment, the Russian soldiers didn't just look like monsters. They looked like judgment. They looked like the consequences of the German use of poison gas coming back to punish the users. The men in the mist were not just soldiers fighting for a patch of land. In that brief, violent hour, they became the physical embodiment of the war's cruelty. They showed the world that there is no weapon, no gas, and no strategy that can fully extinguish the human capacity for defiance. Kotlinski died. Strzeminski lost his body, but found his art. The peasants of Voronezh were buried in mass graves that have since been lost to the swamp. But in their collective suffering, they created a biography that transcends their individual lives. They ceased to be a regiment of the Tsar and became a timeless archetype, the soldiers who refused to accept the permission to die. As we move forward to look at the German diaries in the next chapter, keep these faces in your mind. Not the memes, not the heavy metal album covers, but the 21-year-old boy suffocating in the mud and the farmers who followed him into the fog because they had nowhere else to go. History is famously written by the victors, but in the case of the attack of the dead men, the victors, the Russians, were silenced by their own revolutionary government, and the losers, the Germans, were silenced by shame. To fully understand the nightmare of Osowiec, we cannot simply look at the heroic charge of Kotlinski. We must cross the expanse of no man's land. We must step into the trenches of the 11th Landwehr Division and look through the fogged, green-tinted lenses of the men who pulled the trigger on the gas. The German experience of August 6, 1915, is a study in the collapse of the human mind. It is a story of how the most disciplined army in the world, backed by the most advanced science of the age, was broken by a primal, superstitious terror. To understand their panic, we must first understand who these men were. The soldiers facing Osowiec were not the young, elite stormtroopers who would define the later years of the war. They were the Landwehr. In the German military system, the Landwehr were reservists, older men, usually between the ages of 35 and 45. These were fathers, husbands, farmers, and shopkeepers. They were men who had already served their mandatory time in the youth and had returned to civilian life, only to be called back up when the war engulfed Europe. They were steady, reliable, and deeply disciplined, but they were not fanatical. They were tired men fighting a war far from home, longing for the comforts of Bavaria or Prussia. They trusted their officers, and more importantly, they trusted the method of the German war machine. They were told that the German way of war was superior because it was rational, scientific, and orderly. On the morning of August the 6th, that trust was absolute. They had been told by their commanders that the capture of the Osowiec Fortress would be a walkover. They were promised that the new wonder weapon, the gas, would do the work for them. They were assured that they would not be fighting a battle, but simply occupying a graveyard. The preparation for the attack was marked by a deep sense of unease. The Landwehr infantry had a complicated relationship with the gas pioneers, the specialist units who handled the cylinders. To the average infantryman, these pioneers were like alchemists or black magicians. They tinkered with heavy metal tanks that hissed and leaked. They wore strange, rubberized suits. They checked the wind vanes with an obsessive, cult-like devotion. The infantry kept their distance. They knew that if a Russian artillery shell hit those tanks, or if a valve rusted through, they would all die screaming in their own trenches. For 10 days, the 11th Landwehr Division waited. Waiting is the soldier's curse, but waiting for a gas attack is a specific kind of torture. Every time the wind shifted, a ripple of panic would move down the line. They were living next to a sleeping dragon. When the order finally came at 4 a.m., the relief was palpable. Finally, the waiting was over. The valves were opened. The hiss began. Now, we must focus on the sensory experience of the German soldier. As the green cloud rolled away from them, they were ordered to don their masks. The German gas mask of 1915, the Gummimask, rubber mask, was a piece of equipment that induced its own form of terror. It was made of rubberized fabric that smelled of chemicals and stale sweat. It had no exhale valve, meaning the soldier had to breathe against the resistance of the filter. It was hot, suffocating, and claustrophobic. Crucially, the eye lenses were often made of celluloid or poor quality glass that fogged up almost immediately. The world inside the mask was blurry, distorted, and dim. To the German soldier, the battlefield didn't look like reality. It looked like a green-tinted, foggy dreamscape. They were isolated inside their own heads, hearing only the rasp of their own labored breathing. At roughly 4:30 a.m., the order to advance was given. 7,000 men climbed out of their trenches. The psychological disintegration began during the walk. As they crossed the several kilometers of marshland between their lines and the fortress, they walked through the footprint of the gas. They saw what the science had done. They saw the grass. It wasn't just dead, it was black and brittle, crunching under their jackboots like burnt paper. They saw the trees, stripped of leaves in the height of summer, but most horrifyingly, they saw the animals. The marshes were full of wildlife, frogs, birds, small mammals. They were all dead. The Germans stepped over carpets of dead birds that had fallen from the sky. They saw hares and foxes that had clawed at their own throats in their final moments. This was the death march. It created a profound sense of moral, injury, and dread. Even for hardened soldiers, this didn't feel like war. It felt like a crime against nature. It felt like they were trespassing in a place where God had left. The silence was absolute. No birdsong, no wind in the trees, just the thud of 7,000 pairs of boots and the muffled commands of officers shouting through their masks. They reached the first line of Russian trenches. They found the Russian scouts dead. The bodies were twisted, faces purple and blue, hands clutching their throats. The Germans nodded to each other. The weapon had worked. The officers were right. There was no enemy left. They relaxed. The tension of the assault bled away, replaced by the grim boredom of a clean-up operation. They slung their rifles over their shoulders. They began to chat, as best they could through the masks. Some units began to break formation, moving casually through the ruins, looking for souvenirs or supplies. They were tourists in a tomb. And then the tomb opened. The breakdown of the German army at Osowiec is a textbook example of mass psychogenic panic. Panic is not just fear, it is a contagion. It spreads like a virus. It usually starts with a single sensory input that contradicts reality. For the Germans, that input was the sight of the 13th Company rising from the earth. We must look at this through the eyes of a 40-year-old Bavarian reservist. He is tired. He is wearing a fogged-up mask. He is superstitious. He has just walked through a mile of dead nature. He believes with 100% certainty that no human being is alive in front of him. Suddenly, a shape emerges from the green mist. It looks like a man, but it is wrong. The face is melting. The skin is a bruised dark violet. The eyes are red pits of blood. The mouth is open, hanging slack, and it is spewing a fountain of blood and mucus. And this thing is running at him. It is screaming, but the scream is a wet, gurgling rattle. The German soldier's brain tries to process this. Is it a Russian soldier? Impossible. They are dead. Is it a survivor? Impossible. Look at him. He has no lungs. Is it a ghost? In that split second of cognitive dissonance, the discipline of the German army evaporated. The Landwehr soldiers did not see an enemy unit counter-attacking. They saw judgment. They saw the dead rising to punish them for using the poison. The panic started at the front. The lead units, confronted by Kotlinski's charging zombies, froze. Then someone screamed. It might have been Die Toten, the dead, or simply a wordless cry of terror. The scream triggered the flight response. The front line turned and ran. But here is where the tragedy of the panic deepens. They ran back into their own advancing lines. The soldiers in the second and third waves, who hadn't seen the Russians yet, suddenly saw their own comrades sprinting toward them, eyes wide with terror, screaming about monsters. Panic is infectious. The second line didn't wait to see what was coming. They assumed that if the first line was running, something horrific must be happening. They turned and ran too. The result was a chaotic, crushing stampede. 7,000 men tried to occupy the same narrow paths back through the marshes. They trampled each other. They dropped their rifles, their packs, their machine guns. In their desperation to escape the ghosts, they ran blindly into their own barbed wire defenses. Men were torn apart by their own fortifications, screaming in the wire as the dead men limped toward them with bayonets. German diaries recovered from the period, though rare and often fragmented, paint a picture of total confusion. One account from a soldier in the 18th Landwehr Regiment, part of the supporting force, describes the scene. We heard a strange sound from the front, like a great wind. Then our men came running. They had no rifles. They had no helmets. Their eyes were wild. They screamed that the Russians were not men, that they were devils who drank the gas. We could not stop them. The officers drew their pistols and threatened to shoot the runners, but it was no use. The fear was stronger than the bullet. Another fragment, found in a letter home that was likely censored or never sent, reads, "I do not want to go back to that place. The air there is heavy with sin. We killed them. I know we killed them. I saw their faces, black and burned. But they stood up. They stood up and came for us. I saw a man with no chin, only blood, and he raised his rifle. God has turned his face from us." The shame of this rout was immense. These were German soldiers, raised on the myth of Prussian invincibility, routed by a handful of dying invalids. The officers were furious. The high command was incredulous. How could a division be defeated by a company? The official reports tried to sterilize the event. They blamed heavy resistance and unexpected flank attacks. They blamed the gas lingering in the ruins. They refused to write down the truth, that their men had run away from ghosts. But the trauma lingered. This was the birth of a specific kind of war neurosis, shell shock, among the German survivors. For years after the war, veterans of the 11th Landwehr would suffer from nightmares. They didn't dream of artillery or bayonets. They dreamed of green fog and bleeding men. The German Diary of Osowiec is a book of blank pages and suppressed memories. It is the story of men who looked into the abyss of chemical warfare and saw the abyss staring back at them with red, bleeding eyes. The psychological impact of the dead men on the German forces reveals a fundamental truth about warfare. Technology has limits. You can build a gun that shoots 420mm shells. You can brew a gas that dissolves lungs. But you cannot engineer a soldier who is immune to the primal fear of the undead. The Germans lost at Osowiec not because they were outgunned, but because they were outscared. They were defeated by the visual horror of their own creation. The attack of the dead men was a mirror. The Germans looked into the mist and saw the monstrosity of what they had done, and they ran from it. As the sun set on August 6th, the German lines were quiet. The officers paced, trying to reorganize the shattered battalions. The men sat in the mud, shivering, cleaning the mud from their boots, trying to rationalize what they had seen. They knew they would have to go back. They knew the war wasn't over, but they also knew that they had crossed a line. They had opened a door that should have stayed shut, and in the distance, from the ruined fortress, the silence was total. The dead men had stopped screaming. But for the men of the Landwehr, the scream would echo in their sleep for the rest of their lives. This leads us to a darker question that we will explore in the next chapter. If the soldiers knew the truth, and the diaries recorded the horror, why was the story buried so deep? Why did it take 100 years for us to open these diaries and read the words written in trembling hands? The answer lies in the nature of shame. Osowiec was a battle that no one wanted to claim. The Russians couldn't claim it because it was a Tsarist victory. The Germans couldn't claim it because it was a humiliating defeat. And so, the diary was closed, the cover was locked, and the dead men were left to wait for us to find them. But the ink is still visible if you know where to look, and it tells a story not of glory, but of a green, suffocating hell where the dead refused to stay down. To truly finish this deep dive, we cannot simply leave the story in 1915. We must travel to the present day. We must drive roughly 50 kilometers northwest of Białystok, Poland, to a quiet, unassuming stretch of the Biebrza National Park. If you go there today, you will find a landscape of breathtaking natural beauty. The Biebrza marshes are one of the largest wildlife sanctuaries in Europe. It is a place of silence, broken only by the calls of migratory birds, cranes, eagles, and ruffs. It is lush, green, and peaceful. It looks like a paradise for hikers and nature photographers. But if you look closer, if you look at the ground beneath the trees, you will see that the earth is wrong. The ground is pockmarked with unnatural depressions, massive craters that have become ponds, and ridges that are too straight to be natural. This is the scar tissue of the Great War. This is the Osowiec Fortress today. The site of the attack of the dead men is not a museum. It is not a manicured memorial with gift shops and paved walkways like Verdun or the Somme. It is a ruin, largely reclaimed by the forest, and it is arguably one of the most haunting places on the entire Eastern Front. To walk through Osowiec today is to engage in dark tourism at its most visceral. The fortress complex comprises 4 distinct forts, but it is Fort Sieux, Central, and Fort 2, Zarzeczny, that draw the most attention. When you approach Fort Y, you are immediately struck by the sheer violence that was visited upon this place. The concrete walls of the barracks and the caponiers are not just cracked, they are pulverized. You can still see the impact points of the Big Bertha shells. These are not small pockmarks. We are talking about holes the size of cars punched through 2 meters of reinforced masonry. The steel reinforcing bars, the rebar, twist out of the concrete like the ribs of a decaying leviathan. One of the most chilling features of the site is the crater fields. The 4 20mm siege mortars fired by the Germans didn't just destroy buildings, they reshaped the geography. There are craters here that are 30 feet deep, now filled with stagnant, dark water. These are the footprints of the monsters that hammered the garrison for 6 months. When you stand on the edge of one of these craters, you begin to understand why the Russian High Command thought survival was impossible. The physics of the destruction are overwhelming, but the true danger of Osowiec is not in the history books. It is in the dirt. The fortress is still considered a hazardous zone. The iron harvest, the phenomenon where farmers and hikers find unexploded ordnance, is a very real daily reality here. The Germans fired tens of thousands of shells at this position. Not all of them exploded. Deep in the mud of the marshes, preserved by the anaerobic, oxygen-free conditions of the swamp, lie hundreds of unexploded artillery shells. Some of them are conventional high explosives, others are chemical. Archaeologists and military engineers who work in the area treat the ground with extreme caution. There is a persistent local rumor, supported by some geological surveys, that several of the German gas cylinders from 1915 sank into the bog without discharging or were buried during the artillery barrages. This means that theoretically, the Green Death is still waiting down there, trapped in corroded steel, waiting for an excavator or a shovel to wake it up. The presence of this unexploded ordnance adds a layer of tension to the site. When you visit, you are told strictly to stay on the marked paths. To wander off into the bush is to risk stepping on a mine or a shell from a war that ended a century ago. The war here never really stopped. It just went underground. Then there is the chemical legacy. For decades after the battle, the locals reported that the vegetation around the fortress was different. The chlorine and bromine mixture settled into the soil. While nature has largely recovered, there are specific types of moss and lichen growing on the concrete bunkers that are chemically distinct. They feed on the minerals leached from the war materials. The copper fittings of the fortress, door handles, shell casings, ventilation grates, are often found covered in a thick, unnatural green patina, a direct result of the chlorine oxidation. Entering the tunnels of Fort Is is an experience that survivors describe as heavy. These are the same casemates where the men of the 226th Regiment huddled during the bombardment. They are dark, damp, and smell of wet brick and iron. There is no electric lighting in the deeper sections. You have to bring a torch. As the beam of light cuts through the darkness, you see the graffiti of 100 years. Some of it is modern teenage vandalism, but if you look deeper, you find inscriptions in Cyrillic, dates scratched into the wall from 1915. The acoustics in these tunnels are terrifying. A single footstep echoes for seconds. It is easy, too easy, to imagine the sound of coughing echoing in these confined spaces. This is the acoustic memory of the site. It was here, in this darkness, that the men cleaned their rifles, bandaged their wounds, and listened to the hiss of the gas seeping through the firing slits. One of the most poignant locations is the ruins of the regimental church. It was destroyed during the siege, but the foundations remain. It was here that many of the men would have prayed before the final attack. Now trees grow directly out of the stone floor. It is a perfect visual metaphor. The empire is gone, the Tsar is gone, the church is gone, but the life of the forest continues. But where are the bodies? This is the great mystery of Osowiec. We know that hundreds of men died during the gas attack and the subsequent fighting. We know that the survivors had to evacuate quickly. They did not have time for elaborate funerals. Most of the dead were buried in mass graves near the fortress walls. Over the last century, the location of many of these graves has been lost. The marshes are a shifting landscape. The ground moves. It swallows things. It is highly likely that beneath the boardwalks and the hiking trails of the national park, the remains of the dead men are still there, perfectly preserved by the peat of the swamp. In recent years, volunteer groups and historical societies have attempted to locate and mark these graves. When they do find remains, the forensic evidence is often heartbreaking. They find boots with the foot bones still inside. They find Orthodox crosses worn around the necks. They find rusted Mosin Nagant rifles with the bayonets still fixed, the steel corroded, but the wood of the stock still intact. These discoveries remind us that the zombies of the legend were human beings. They were young men who wore crosses, wrote letters, and smoked pipes. There is also a German cemetery nearby. It is often overlooked, but it is part of the story too. Here lie the soldiers of the Landwehr who died during the initial assaults or from the Russian artillery fire. It is a somber place, a reminder that the suffering was bilateral. The trees shade the Russian and German dead equally. The atmosphere of Osowiec today is hard to define. It is not exactly haunted in the ghost story sense, but it is possessed of a heavy, solemn energy. Visitors often report a sudden drop in temperature when entering the forts, even in summer. Birdwatchers have noted that in certain areas of the crater fields, the birds go silent. Maybe it is the acoustics, maybe it is the knowledge of what happened, or maybe it is the sheer weight of the tragedy pressing down on the landscape. The Polish government and the local authorities have done a good job of preserving the site as a permanent ruin. They have not rebuilt it, they have simply stopped it from falling down completely. This choice is important. To rebuild Osowiec would be to sanitize it. To leave it as a ruin is to let the wounds show. When you walk the path of the charge, the distance seems impossibly long. You stand in the Russian trenches and look toward the German lines, and you realize they had to run hundreds of meters. You try to hold your breath for as long as you can, simulating the lack of oxygen, and you realize you can't make it 10 steps, let alone a full charge. The physical reality of the site destroys the superhero myth and replaces it with awe. You realize that what happened here was physically impossible, and yet the craters prove it happened. The rusted shrapnel proves it happened. As night falls over the Bibersa National Park, the fog begins to rise from the marshes. It is a natural phenomenon, a result of the temperature difference between the water and the air. But for anyone who knows the story, seeing that white mist curl around the shattered concrete bunkers is a terrifying image. It looks like the ghosts are coming back. The ruins of Osowiec are a tomb of concrete. They are a monument to the worst of humanity, the chemical weapons, the industrial slaughter, and the best of humanity, the courage to stand and fight against the odds. The fortress failed in its purpose. The Germans eventually took it, after it was abandoned. The Russian Empire fell. The railway line it protected is now a quiet track through a nature reserve. Strategically, all the death was for nothing. But as a symbol, the concrete tomb stands for everything. It stands for the idea that the human spirit is harder than stone and stronger than poison. As we prepare to close this deep dive in the final chapter, we must take the lessons from these stones and ask the final question. Why do we remember this story now, after forgetting it for so long? And what does the attack of the dead men teach us about the wars of the future? The stones are silent, but if you listen closely to the wind in the trees, you can almost hear the echo of a wet, rattling cough. As we stand at the end of this journey, looking back through the green fog of August 1915, we are left with a question that goes beyond tactics and history. It is a question about the nature of humanity itself. Why does the attack of the dead men haunt us? There were thousands of battles in the Great War. There were battles with higher body counts, battles with more strategic importance, and battles with more famous generals. The siege of Osowiec in the grand calculus of World War I was a footnote. It did not stop the German advance for long. It did not save the Russian Empire from collapse. By the cold logic of military history, it should have been forgotten, and yet it refuses to die. The story survives because it touches upon a primal fear and a primal hope. The fear is the fear of erasure. The gas attack was not just an attempt to kill soldiers. It was an attempt to erase them. It was an industrial chemical effort to turn human beings into biological sludge, to deny them their individuality and their dignity. The Germans didn't want to fight. They wanted a sterilization. The hope, however, is found in the response. The attack of the dead men is the ultimate proof that the human spirit cannot be quantified. Fritz Haber and the German chemists treated war as an equation. If volume of gas, X, lung capacity, Y, then victory is certain. Vladimir Kotlinski and the men of the 13th Company broke that equation. They introduced a variable that science could not measure: defiance. They proved that a man can be biologically dead, his lungs dissolved, his blood turning to acid, his eyes blinded, and yet he can still choose to stand up. He can still choose to be dangerous. This is the eternal echo of Osowiec. It is the scream that proves we are not just biological machines. However, we must be careful with how we handle this legacy. In the 21st century, the internet has turned the attack of the dead men into a myth. We see the heavy metal videos, the undead memes, and the digital art of zombie soldiers. It is easy to view this as a cool, badass moment in history, a real-life horror movie where the good guys win. But if we strip away the memes, we are left with the tragedy. We must remember that these were not superheroes. They were farm boys from Voronezh. They were 20-year-olds who died in excruciating pain, drowning in their own fluids, miles away from their mothers. To treat their suffering purely as entertainment is to do them a disservice. We honor them not by calling them zombies, but by recognizing them as men who endured the unendurable. The legacy of Osowiec also casts a long shadow over the laws of war. The horror of what happened there and at Ypres shocked the conscience of the world. It led directly to the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which banned the use of chemical and biological weapons in warfare. The dead men were the martyrs who proved that some weapons are too terrible to be used, even in the madness of total war. Yet the echo warns us that ink on paper is fragile. The ban held for WWI, largely due to mutual fear, but chemical weapons have returned in modern conflicts. We have seen them in the Middle East. We have seen nerve agents used in assassinations. The green fog is not a relic of the past. It is a monster sleeping in the basement of modern industry. The story of Osowiec serves as a grim sentinel. It warns us of what happens when we let technology outpace our morality. It shows us that when we turn science into a weapon of mass extermination, we create hell on earth. But it also reminds us that even in hell, humanity can survive. The fortress is gone. The empire is gone. The Kaiser is gone. But the image of the cloth-wrapped soldier, coughing blood and charging into the mist, remains. It is the ultimate symbol of the soldier's burden, to carry the weight of the world, even when the air itself is trying to kill you. The attack of the dead men was buried by the Soviets, shamed by the Germans, and ignored by the West. For 70 years, it was a secret kept by the earth and the few survivors who whispered it to their children. But the truth, like the men of the 13th Company, has a way of rising from the grave. We retell this story today, not to glorify war, but to witness the capacity of the human will. We look back at the ruin of Osowiec, and we see a mirror. We see the worst of what we can do to each other, the gas, the hate, the industrial slaughter. But we also see the best of what we are, the courage, the loyalty, and the refusal to submit to the darkness. Vladimir Kotlinski and his men did not survive the war. They did not go home to grow old. Their lives were spent in a single burning hour on a Tuesday morning in August. But in that hour, they wrote a story that will outlast the concrete of the fortress they defended. They taught us that you can kill the body, you can poison the air, and you can burn the earth, but you cannot kill the dead men who refuse to die. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the darkness. This was a heavy story to tell, and I know it was a heavy one to listen to. The story of Osowiec is one of those rare moments in history where reality becomes stranger and more terrifying than fiction. It forces us to confront the true cost of the Great War. I want to take a moment to thank you, the viewer, for sticking around until the very end. Long-form content like this, where we really take the time to explore the forensic details and the forgotten lives, only exists because of your support. If you believe that these stories deserve to be told, and if you want to help us uncover more historical lies and forgotten nightmares, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but it makes a massive difference in helping us research and produce these documentaries. I'll see you in the next deep dive. Stay curious and stay safe.